This founder and his team built a platform to create lifelike characters for immersive experiences like games or books. In this show, Kylan Gibbs shares his thoughts on generative AI and how to manage products where you have to create immersive experiences. He also discusses his career journey. Kylan is a former product manager at DeepMind. He was also a consultant at Bain and a co-founder at FlowX. Now he's a CPO and co-founder at Inworld AI. Hey, Kylan, welcome to the show. Tell us about where you are in your product journey, a little bit about your product as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here. So at Inworld, we're building a creative suite of tools that allow people to build these AI characters and then integrate them into immersive experiences, games, entertainment, enterprise experiences as well. And we started just over a year and a half ago. And basically where we're at now is we have the studio where people can come in and actually craft their characters. We've got integrations with things like Unity, Unreal, where they can bring them into games, as well as Node for actually bringing these into web experiences. We've also then got sort of this arcade and basically, which is a way to actually share these characters directly to the web, and then a suite of experiences that we're going to be releasing this year that are self-produced. So we've got, for example, Inworld Origins to sort of show off the power of the product. And this is all to sort of say that this is kind of crafting that end-to-end user journey of being able to build these characters and then bring them into worlds. And basically where this has all been going is kind of setting the foundations of actually being able to not just create the characters, but build them into experiences and deploy them scalably. And I think compared to a lot of the things you're seeing in generative AI right now, like it really is production ready, and we've been focused on that. And so we've already seen a lot of developers starting to churn out games and experiences now that are integrating in-world characters. So it's super exciting to kind of see that. But so of course, it's still early on. I'm excited to see where it goes, but already seeing hundreds and thousands of users using it, plus actually seeing live experiences is pretty magical.
Wow, there's a lot there. So let me just quickly ask you a follow-up question on you support game creators, is that right? Or you support all kinds of creators like writers, novelists, or just focus on gaming experiences at this time?
We're supporting really any type of creator. So ultimately, we have users who are, for example, very well-known science fiction authors who are using their characters to iterate on experiences and potentially write new books with. We have people actually building like AAA games and these types of experiences where you're building multiple characters and integrating them into worlds. We have entertainment companies who you imagine integrating into parks or like live experiences where you're actually interacting with it. And then we also have enterprises who are using these for things like brand representation, corporate training. So really, we're open to any types of creators. Of course, we're really focused on narrative-oriented immersive experiences, and our product is best built for that. So, games, narrative, entertainment, you can think about the adaptation of movie and IP to these experiences. And that's really what we're targeting. But we're really open to any types of creators, and we're finding out new ones every day.
Yeah, I picked up a keyword there, narrative-oriented immersive experiences. That could be representing multiple customer segments. What is your product journey like? How do you go about defining your product capabilities with such a broad range that, you could be doing?
I think that, so abstracting out of our specific use case for a second, like I think when you're building a developer tool, you always have two customers you have to keep in mind. One is your creators, your developers, and the other is your end users. And so for us, our creator journey is really people coming in, they have ideas, either they're building an existing experience or they're ideating on a new one, and they're using the studio and our characters to basically iterate on that and then integrate it through things like Unity and Unreal to actually bring those to users. And so when we think about success in that, it's basically, is this person able to create the character that they love and like and kind of represents the vision that they have and fulfills the purpose? And then are they able to integrate that and deploy that successfully? Then you have the actual end users, which are the people actually interacting with the characters that the developers built. And those is really like, is the interaction enjoyable? Is the person staying around to talk with this character? Are they finding out what they need to progress through this experience? So you can imagine throughout a game, you have someone that's a guide or a shopkeeper and they have to fulfill a particular role. Are they doing that successfully? And so you really have to balance the two of those. I think that's true for most developer tools, but it's kind of unique here because ultimately there's a key part here, which is like, it's the generated content. So it's almost like, are we allowing developers to create characters that are fulfilling the wants that they have for the users in the end? And so it's always a little bit of a art and a science.
Yeah, there's a lot of art there, especially when it comes to the narrative, the experience, right? The character creation and then narrative and the experience. What are some of the ways you create these characters that actually immerse themselves and are conducive to the experience? Is there a difference in product creation? How do you actually adapt to the narrative or the experience that the creator is trying to create?
Yeah, I guess there's 2 points, which is like design time and runtime here. So at design time, you could take, for example, a raw large language model and generate sort of responses that are aligned with a particular character. But getting them to do that reliably and stick to a story and actually fulfill goals and actions is very difficult. So we actually allow users to come in and they can specify, for example, scenes for their story. And then the characters will actually stick to basically kind of motivations and goals that they have for that specific scene. Then we allow them to specify, what is this character supposed to accomplish from this? How are they supposed to speak? What types of things in the world might they be reacting to? And all of that sort of is going towards controlling and biasing the character behavior in a specific moment within a specific story. So they're fulfilling what they're supposed to. And that's all kind of the design side. When you're actually interacting with the character, then we introduce, for example, emotions. So the characters actually react with emotionality. We have voices that also integrate that emotionality. So the characters can actually, you can hear when you upset a character, for example, and you can react to that. We then control gestures and animations. The characters can actually react to you, or you can ask them to perform a particular action and they can actually act on that. And so that ability to actually have, and we'll be releasing this soon, and we have a new system where you can actually, for example, give a character a goal and a series of actions that they can use to pursue that goal, and they'll autonomously pursue the goal until they've accomplished it, which is like a pretty magical thing if you think about the ability to actually create this living thing that's kind of pursuing goals and motivations. But of course, all of that comes back to the ability to actually drive this story or narrative forward, whether it's something like Assassin's Creed or Far Cry or one of these games, or you can think about even an enterprise experience where you're trying to usher a user forward through sort of a brand experience. All of it is really the key point is that the characters are fulfilling a specific purpose within some broader experience. Yeah. And so we've got a huge amount of controls that are available to enable that.
That's very interesting. You mentioned that you are able to add emotionality to a character. Wow, that blows my mind. Is there anything more you can share about how you go about doing that? I'm personally interested in that because a few years ago, I created a startup to inject emotionality in the writing. And that time there were no LLMs or any of that available. And it was pretty challenging, but I would love to hear how it's done in 2023, 2024. Yeah.
Yeah. So right now, our system is really composed. So when you as a user are interacting with a character, you're taking all of that input. So whether it's audio, visual, sort of event side. So you imagine a unit on Unreal, you have these events that happen, and all of that get fed through basically a series of, you can think of like heuristics models or models that are representing different parts of function. So for example, you have a goal-oriented module, you have emotions, all these kinds of things. And so emotions is literally kind of, you can think about it as an engine that is taking in the character's current state, taking in all those inputs from the user, updating the current emotional state, and then that feeds out emotion as basically one input to the overall behavior of the character. So then they'll respond to you, incorporating that emotion into their conversation or their visual representation, all these kinds of things. And so literally the emotion engine is effectively this module that takes in inputs from different modalities, updates basically this emotion, which is represented as a continuous state, and then outputs a discrete state, which is like happy, sad, frustrated, and distressed, these kinds of things.
Okay, we're going to switch up the gears a little bit. I think this is not your first AI startup. I think you have created many AI startups in the past. Tell us about your journey leading up to this Inworld experience, and what were the learning lessons that you have to share with aspiring product creators? What are some of so first set the context and then tell us your learning lessons.
Yeah, so my background was pretty atypical. I didn't set my trajectory to become an AI product leader. It all really started with I was actually starting to go into politics and then realized that in order to aggregate people's interests and insights and actually understand what they really needed, you couldn't do that manually. You needed to use something like data science or machine learning. And so I actually started using it for that purpose, as basically working with a city to understand population interests. And then my first steps into the startup world were after I finished my master's, I worked with a few friends to basically create a company that we were applying machine vision to CCTV, which is like security cameras, and basically extracting out information. And the idea there was to be able to feed that into traffic systems. So you could actually optimize traffic systems in real time in cities in the UK. We were working with Singapore and the UK at the time. And that was a super interesting first learning experience because, of course, going through the straight out of university, doing the startup life was very different than it was this time around. But taught me a lot about, I think, the importance of, one, accepting the technical complexity of what you're working with, which I think can be very dramatically underestimated, and really being realistic with yourself about what you can do and how much you can accomplish without a team. And then also thinking a bit more scalably. For example, working with the public sector is a big challenge. So maybe it's not the best place to start out a machine learning product, these kinds of things. And then I left that and went into consulting. So I worked at Bain and Company and helped set up machine learning practice there and worked as a data scientist cross consultant, which was very interesting and got exposure to a lot of industries. I think the key thing was at that point, which is several years ago now, getting in uptake from a lot of these large organizations, especially around innovative things like machine learning at that time, especially was very challenging. And also the way that consulting firms or like large corporates work, sometimes it's amenable to building really hardcore tech, whereas you're basically focused on churning out client projects versus actually building something foundational. And so you have to put the time into that. Then I was lucky enough to meet someone who was moving over to DeepMind while I was at Bain and transitioned over to DeepMind. Well, at DeepMind, I first started working, helping set up the research strategy and doing, basically we were doing like meta analyses of research across, the industry to inform like research directions. And then around that time, sort of GPT-3 came out and a lot of these sort of large language model efforts came out. And I was working then as the product lead for conversational AI and generative models as they pertain to sort of language tasks and these kinds of things at DeepMind. And so I was working across Google to basically integrate DeepMind tech into Google products. And so super interesting, basically learning about even within Google, where are the challenges of applying generative models and like, this more advanced AI, which is a lot more challenges than people would probably anticipate from the outset. And then that also informed how I thought about, okay, the benefits of being in a large company versus being in a startup or working in product in a small startup where you have a lot more capacity for experimentation. When you launch something, it doesn't have to work for 1 billion users from day one. You have that capacity to work with a smaller group of users to refine a product and then actually be able to scale that up. So while I was there, I met Mike, who is my current co-founder and CTO, who was leading AI and ML at Cloud Conversational AI. And then Ilya, he founded Dialogflow or API.ai, which became Dialogflow when acquired by Google. And so that's how Inworld was born. Yeah. And then I think of course, this has been sort of a rocket ship. So there's been a lot of learnings along last year. So I could pause there, but I'm keen to share as well a bit about what we've learned in the last year or so.
Wow, there's like 5 careers in that one career. Thank you for sharing.
Yes.
What do you recommend? What are some of the things that you recommend avoiding? Brand new PM, just thinking of becoming a product person or a product creator. What are the things they should avoid doing? Absolutely. If they want to be thriving in the AI space.
Yeah, I would say, boil it down, I would say like, don't philosophize. What I see a lot of people doing, I think because they're mimicking so when people have been successful towards the end of their career, they start to philosophize and they go on Twitter and they go on blog posts about all their philosophies and learnings. And so what I see people doing at the beginning of their career is basically starting out with that versus actually building something that validates what they've actually done and proves that they're valuable. So don't start by trying to teach people lessons before you've actually learned anything. But that also translates, I think, into actually how you build products. And I think it's increasingly where the differences between even like software development as it existed 15, 20 years ago and what we're doing now with a lot more AI and ML is things need to be a lot more iterative because outcomes aren't as deterministic. So you don't know, for example, if a feature is going to be successful. One, because the actual development of a new machine learning model doesn't directly translate into like some specific, it's not like you're adding a button to a page that has some outcome for a user. It may or may not increase performance and quality in some other ways. And so what I frankly learned the hard way was you shouldn't set out, for example, like long-term visions or roadmaps. This is like a very classic thing that I see being told to a lot of early PMs is like, build out your roadmap, build out your 5-year roadmap, break it down to 1 year and then 6 months. I think that like process is a lot less sexy, but is ultimately far more important. And I see so many PMs like across their career basically, oh no, I don't want to be involved in any organizational stuff. Like I don't want to be involved in the Jira tickets or these kinds of things. But I think a really good PM is basically able to take the vision that they have in their head and then turn that into basically a machine or a process that like naturally pushes people towards the direction that you're working in, but is able to adapt to like the market pressures, the reactions, the user feedback. Because if you basically plant a point on the map that you're working towards, you're going to be so biased by every time that you perturbate from that point that I think you're not going to end up in the optimal state. Whereas what you really want to do, and this is coming from the AI and ML world, in AI and ML, you have this idea of gradient descent, which is basically you're doing an optimization problem where you're trying to find like the lowest point in a space. I think of good product building is basically inverse gradient descent. So you're trying to always find like the highest point. And if you say, I'm getting to the top of that hill is my goal, hands down, that's all I'm going to do, you might be missing the fact that there's like a mountain on the other side of that hill. And so you should build yourself, you should build your product, you should build the organization and the process around your product, all to be able to constantly take in that feedback and shift dramatically. So for example, I've now set up our organization to be more focused on smaller iterative cycles. So breaking down, you have like larger term, longer term efforts, which you know are important and thematic. And then you break those down into 2-week increments. So it's like more standard sprint planning. But the challenge is that with NML products, it's a bit more experimentation. So it's not like you're necessarily saying, we're going to have this launch and have this impact in 2 weeks. So I'm going to run this experiment within the next 2 weeks because I think it might have this outcome. And if it's successful, we'll build on that. And so it's really like taking that long-term vision that you have, setting the metrics, setting the sort of general directions that you have, setting your feedback channels from users, and then being able to constantly turn that into experiments that you want to run, both with developing hardcore tech, if you're doing a deep tech startup, or turning that into user research or user experiments, you've been doing something that's more front-end based.
Very interesting analogy there with gradient descent. I often use the same analogy, but I use a different term for it. Global maxima. Find your global maxima. Yeah, I love that. Let me ask you this question. Where do you think this is going? This whole generative AI, especially, and then if you want to narrow down to your specific space, I would love to hear that.
Yeah. So I generally think where we're moving towards is in the same way that you had basic automation of things like databases and things over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I think we're moving to a place where a lot of like hardcore knowledge tasks are going to be automated. And ultimately, this means like things like you imagine as a PM creating a PRD. You could probably generate a pretty good PRD with ChatGPT. Barely better than most starting out PMs. And you can create like slide generators now for people who are in consulting. There's a lot of these things. So like knowledge tasks are becoming more automated. And I think it puts a lot more pressure on ideas and creativity as like the actual goal of what actually humans contribute to this whole process. And so what I see happening over the next 10 years is a lot of the things that people held as basically their like unique value are going to be eroded, as what happens like with any technology innovation. But what that means is, so let's say that was only 1% of the population. Now those skills are accessible to 80% of the population. So the overall value created by everyone goes up dramatically, but it takes away like the feeling, the niche sense of value that small group once had. And so what I think needs to happen is for people who are very, highly technical, knowledge oriented, that feel like this is impacting their work. Question is not, oh no, how do I react to these things being taken over? It's like, how do I also now become an expert in taking advantage of these tools? So for example, in our case, so you have amazing game developers, narrative designers, writers who are creating video games. And it's not the fact that creating these AI characters who are able to basically generate dialogue is going to take away from that. It now means that a single writer could create 100 characters and create all the dialogue for them in the time that it would have taken them before to create one character. And what this really means, I think, is you're just going to have an explosion of content overall. So both in terms of games and things that are directly impacted by us, but of course, there's also the image generation and text generation. And I see music generation happening now. And so I think we're about to enter an era for probably the next 5 years of just like content explosion, where there's just going to be so much of everything and a lot of it's going to be complete noise. And so I think the key thing for like those people who want to continue to be leaders and product leaders in this space is the question is not what can you create, but how can you filter out the noise? So how can you ultimately define what good is? Because it's going to be a lot easier to create something. And so I think that like over the last while, we've seen the benefits of people who are just able to build some hacky prototype. Building a hacky prototype is going to get really easy. So now you've got to figure out like, what are you actually creating that is completely unique and like applies some creative sense, not just necessarily some technical or general sense or applying some framework, because guess what? All these generative models have now taken in that framework and know it. So you don't really have anything special. So you have to come up with something actually new now. And I think that's where it's all going, is like a content explosion that biases us to really thinking about what the content is that we want to create, not just the fact that we can create content.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Kylan. Thank you for making time for us. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to have you back on the show once you have a few more lessons to share with us.
For sure. Thank you so much.